of George J. Clemeson of 606 Curtis Road, East Lansing, Michigan 48823. George's phone number is area code 517-332-8759. The recording was made by Helen Earley and Jim Walkinshaw at the Oldsmobile History Center at 4000 North Grand River in Lansing, Michigan on November 28, 1988. This is tape number 1 of 2 tapes. Hey George, if you would, perhaps you could give us your current address and your name and your phone number if you would.
Well, we start with my name. It's George Clemeson, with the middle initial J. I live at 606 Curtis Road in East Lansing, where I've lived for the last 32 years after being transferred here from Dallas, Texas, when I became an assistant general sales manager for Oldsmobile.
Okay. What's your phone number over there?
My phone number is 332-8759.
Okay.
Thank you. Now why don't you start with your story of being in the Air Force and being interviewed by Mr. Stroud. Your step.
Well, my being with Oldsmobile, like with General Motors, is a matter of several coincidences. First of all, in 1941, I was able to get a job with Motors Insurance / GEIC, the division insurance of General Motors, as a staff adjuster. Shortly afterwards, I became underwriter accountant, and then I took charge of the cash sale and renewal program, after which time I took a leave of absence from General Motors to go into the Navy, where I became a naval aviator, which I did for about 3 years. I served in that capacity and stationed at the Naval Air Station of Glenview, Illinois, where I had the opportunity to use airplanes, and my wife and daughter lived in Milwaukee during that time, and on weekends I would many times fly up to Milwaukee and visit and then go back again. And on one such occasion, and this was close to the very end of the war, I flew up to Milwaukee. My wife met me at the airport, and on the way in said, "Look, you'll be getting out pretty soon. Why don't we look for a place to live?" So there was a place advertised on Silver Spring Road. I still remember the road. So we stopped to look at this house, and after looking at it and deciding we didn't like it, we came out, and approaching our car from the rear was a 1942 Oldsmobile 98 with a dealer license plate on it, which I recognized as belonging to Mr. Fred Black, our dealer at Lake Park Motors, who came back to our car after parking his, and he said, what are you going to do when you get out of that monkey suit?" referring to my flight jacket. And I said, "Well, I think I'll be going back to MIC. And he said, "Oh, why don't you go with the car division?" I said, "I know nothing about that." He said, "Well, I think you could learn." He said, "In my car up there ahead is Jim Stroud, newly appointed zone manager of the Milwaukee zone, who told me he needs a district manager." So I said, "Well, I'll get in touch with him," which I did the following week, and after a very fine interview, he suggested that they transfer me from Motors Insurance to Oldsmobile. So with that, when I was released from the Navy in October of that year, 1942, no, pardon me, 45, I became a district manager for Oldsmobile, headquartering in Madison, Wisconsin. And to this day, I don't know what my exact duties were, except to call on dealers and see what I could do to help them, at that time, get automobiles, and then later on to sell them. And about one of the most important functions was get them to report the sales to Oldsmobile. So we'd have a good 10-day report.
You mean they actually would forget to report?
No, they had to be encouraged to think in the future as to the cars they were about to deliver. Sometimes that was anticipatory.
I see. Okay.
And then in 1947, Mr. Stroud called me into the office one day and asked me how I'd like to be the assistant zone manager, which was sort of a big jump for a greenhorn in the business. And then it was only another 2 years later, when Mr. Stroud was transferred to Chicago as zone manager, that I succeeded him as zone manager.
Mm-hmm.
So I had quite a rapid rise in the Milwaukee zone.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there as zone manager until 1953, when I became zone manager for the Chicago zone.
Now, you were there during the start of the rocket era.
Yes, yes.
What can you tell us about that time? What happened? What was going on in people's minds? How were we selling those kinds of things?
Well, notoriously, Oldsmobile always built a fine automobile. The only trouble with our models about 1946, 47, 48, the car was not snappy in performance.
Mm-hmm.
It had a rather undersized 6-cylinder engine and a very flat 8-cylinder engine. As a matter of fact, they tried to build some performance into that engine by increasing the compression ratio and increasing the horsepower, but the car did not perform. It was a big, heavy car and very low on performance. Well, about that time, our general manager, who was Mr. Sherrod E. Skinner, along with engineers like Mr. Jack Wolfram and others, decided that we needed a new power plant in the car. And General Motors recognized that too, and Mr. Kettering, Boss Kettering, was asked to give his recommendation as to the type of engine that would give great performance and economy and all the things we're looking for. And Mr. Kettering suggested a square engine, which meant that it was a V8 engine, high compression, where the bore and stroke of the engine were just about the same. They wanted to call that engine that Mr. Kettering suggested the Kettering engine. As a matter of fact, when the project was approved and a building was designated for its manufacture, and I think you might look and see that to this day, above the door it's the Kettering building, or just the name Kettering. But a policy in General Motors preempted that. We couldn't name a product after a person. So at that particular time, the military was depending heavily on rockets, for our defense and so forth. It was a very well-known name. They decided to call our engine the rocket engine. And that was it signaled the rebirth of Oldsmobile, because from a very lackluster type of automobile, it became a high-performance car. 135 horsepower, 7.31 to 1 compression ratio, and just ran everything and anything off the roads. Shortly afterwards, after we got into production, stock car racing became popular, and the Oldsmobile with the rocket engine won first places all over the country. Well, that was the signal incident that really brought Oldsmobile up from the doldrums to a very, very much sought-after automobile, a very popular car. And those of you that might have been around at that time can remember some of the things that we did to promote the car, like a plastic hood, so that you could look into the hood. They had 34 lights, little bulbs that lit up at night, so that you could go and look in the engine compartment of the car. Designed a very handsome radiator ornament. And then along came Futuramic styling in 1950. And that assumed the pattern of the world, with a planet, the Saturn rings. And you can look back and see that on some of our cars.
Was selling cars hard or easy at that juncture?
Well, you got to look back and remember that the war years brought upon a tremendous shortage of cars. The freeze in production went into effect in January 1942. And until the end of the war, which was in the fall of 1945, there was no production. Dealers were only able to sell those cars they had in inventory based upon their being able to get a certificate, a release from the OPA, and they could sell a car to the individual, and they were permitted to add 1% per month for their investment in storage. Now along comes the end of the war, and you've got all these men coming back from the service, all these people who have not been able to buy a car for those years. There's a tremendous built-up demand for cars. So our production for the next couple of years was such that we just could not meet the demand. Production was restricted, distribution was restricted. We had to give cars to dealers on the most equitable bases. And dealers would accept orders from customers and list them numerically. And as the cars would come in, then they would sell the cars to the dealer, make the car available to the customer, I should say. Then about the time it appeared as though we were going to come out of this scarcity, we had the Korean War in 1950 with a real restriction on steel production and sale. So we created a prolonged period of shortage, and it wasn't until about 1955 that we started to see a little daylight, a little light at the end of the tunnel. And from that time on, of course, why we had record production and record sales. So to answer your question, Jim, it was not a problem with selling cars during that time, but the most serious problem was one of equitable distribution, getting cars to the dealers on a basis which we could meet their needs in the best possible way.
How did you do that? How did you distribute them that way so that they would all be sort of happy?
Well, you can't say they could be happy, but you had what we call you had a history of sales in an area, and you had, say, you had a territory, a division of territory, you had a number of dealers in the area, so you try to set up what is called a planning potential for each dealer, which indicated the size of dealership you needed, the number of dealers you needed in an area, the capital requirements, space requirements, and so forth. Then a lot depended upon the manner in which the dealers sold the car. If one dealer ended up with a lot of cars in inventory and he wasn't moving them, well, then we would take and divert his allotment to other dealers. So a plan was devised to try to distribute cars equitably based upon day supply. In other words, you related the number of cars that he had in inventory to the number of cars he sold, and then you projected that out. How long would these cars last, comparing one dealer with the other and trying to be equitable in the distribution of cars to all dealers.
Did dealers in that time with high demand and minimum number of cars, was there a lot of financial problems from dealers going out of business, or had that all happened during the war, if any of that had happened?
Well, now we've got to back up to the Sloan Plan. I think it was referred to as a Sloan Plan. At the outset of the war, dealers were told that they had an option. They could close up their place of business and then plan to reopen at the end of the war, or they could be given a period of 2 years after the war in which to exercise their right to continue their franchise, see. Or they could continue in business, hoping to make money on the sale of used cars and the sale of parts and service and so forth, which most dealers did. But a dealer that elected to take that option, he would then be given a period of time of 2 years at the end of the war. He'd have to wait for 2 years, then he could become a dealer again, providing he met all the other requirements of space, capital, and so forth. But no, dealers were not going broke in that period after the war. As a matter of fact, you'll always find certain people that are greedy. They not only made full profit on the new car, they would under-allow the value of the used car. And you could understand that because they'd gone through a period of 3 or 4 years without anything and really not expecting this honeymoon to last very long. So some of them wanted to make a lot of money in that short period of time right after the war.
So it was kind of a double whammy.
That's right, yeah.
George, how do you select where to place a dealer? Did the corporation do that, or did the divisions?
Oh, that's a very, very complicated question, Helen. First of all, you have to look at an area from the standpoint of its potential. What are the potential sales for your product in that area? From that, you decide, well, how many dealers should you have in that area? Where should they be located? Now, needless to say, let's take an extreme. You have an area that somebody wants to establish a dealership point. We've had this happen where a man will come to us and say, I'm a used car dealer in Watervliet, Michigan. I'd like to have a new car franchise. Well, you look at it and you look at the sales over a period of time, and perhaps there might only be a market for 25 new cars a year. Well, obviously, you're not going to encourage that man to build facilities for that number of cars, are you? So you say it's impractical. And by the same token, where you have a large metropolitan area like Detroit, for example, at one time we had 26 dealers in that area. And the corporation in 1955 decided to take a more careful look at distribution and distribution of dealership locations, and they determined that based upon the number of dealers, based upon the potential in the area, that very likely we had too many dealers there. So we set about a plan for the elimination in an orderly fashion.
Now, how do you do that?
How do you do that, Helen? Well, as I said, you sort of look there and say, how many cars do you expect to sell in this area? You have so many dealers. Well, it's obvious you might have too many dealers, because you've got to look at the total overhead expense. You've got to look at the profit potential. And if you end up with a red figure, that means you've got too many dealers.
But how do you get rid of it?
Well,
in orderly
now,
fashion?
first of all, you say, well, let's take a look at these dealers. Is this one more logically located than that one? Or maybe you've had a change in the population. As you know, we've had so much movement to the suburbs that many of the downtown dealers became in a location that was described as effete. So what you would do, you'd go to that dealer and offer him an opportunity, perhaps to move his dealership, form a new dealership location, or maybe he doesn't want to do anything. Maybe he's up in years. So you'll tell him that, well, we'll give you a stay with you letter for as long as you wish to continue to be a dealer. But at such a time, if, say, you should pass on, or you should elect to get out of business, we must go on record with you now that we don't intend to continue representation in this dealership point. It's a rather complex.
So
and
sort of
you're
an
dealing with emotions too, because
Yes.
a person that might have been in business there, his father before him, now he reaches the point where, well, in many areas like Chicago, for example, on the near south side, southwest side, that area's gone downhill, like a lot of places in these cities. Well, you don't want to tell the fellow, look, your business is no longer any good, so you have to deal with it very carefully. Then, too, there were areas where we were dueled with another line, like with Cadillac. Well, Cadillac at one time had many, many sub-dealers under a dealer that, what am I trying to say? Well, for example, in Boston, we had the Fuller dealership there, Boston Cadillac, that had about 17 sub-dealers under it. Well, those sub-dealers handled anywhere from 15, 17, 18 cars a year. Well, many of those dealers were dueled with Oldsmobile. Now, Cadillac wanted to get rid of those dealers. Well, the dealer was so loyal to Cadillac and saw a rather limited profit potential for Oldsmobile that he elected to give up both deals, you see. But a lot of complicated situations did arise because of that premise. But our purpose, the way you might state it, is to have the optimum number of dealers. That means not too many and not too few, because having too few dealers in an area is just as bad.
Well, would that be a district manager's job to go talk with the dealer?
Oh, no, it's a little higher level
That's
than
what I
that,
was
yes.
wondering.
Yes, that usually starts at regional level and above.
I see. Well, when you first started, say, in the Milwaukee zone, how many regions and zones did Oldsmobile have?
At that particular time in 1945, we had about 22 zones, and I do believe there were 6 regions. And then we got up later on as far as, I think about 1970, 75, we had 28 zones. Well, since that time, they've been cut back, you know. And we've cut back on the number of regions, too.
Well, George, there used to be a Barton Auto Company in Spokane, Wisconsin, or Washington, wasn't it? Now, wasn't that a little different setup than the regular dealership?
Well, I try to remember the name. That's a distributorship, where a dealer has more than one dealership under him.
Oh, yes.
Not
like
necessarily a chain. Chain ownership is a different proposition. I think in Denver at one time we had 3 dealerships there. All, see, I believe that was owned by one dealer. But a distributor has a number of sub-dealers under him.
I see.
And he handled the distribution of cars and parts to those dealers. And he derived a certain % of the gross profit on each automobile that those dealers handled.
But Barton was the only one I remembered Oldsmobile ever had, and they handled the West Coast, as I recall.
Not the West Coast. They might have handled
Well,
a couple of deals.
Just
in
a
that
couple
area.
deals. I see.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Well, now we've got our ideal location for the dealers. We're up in our high production. What do you do when a dealer doesn't step up to the service responsibility?
Well, Helen, that's rather hard to measure. It's a service responsibility. You mean service penetration of the market, or adequate service, or let's say service that's satisfactory to the customer? What do you mean by adequate service?
When the factory or when a zone would get a number of calls or letters from dissatisfied customers.
Well, about the only thing that you can do, Helen, is to go out and talk to the dealer. You have your service personnel. Go out there and see what's wrong. You can take a number of things that could contribute to that. First of all, you start with the attitude of the dealer towards service. You then go on to the facilities to see does he have adequate facilities to handle the volume of service. Then manpower is important, and management in the service department, adequate parts. But I think it all starts with attitude. There are some dealers that just are not service-minded. And you just have to change that and turn that around.
Has that philosophy changed at all during the time that you were there, George, from the time in the 40s to the 70s?
No, I think that there's one very, very big thing that's taken place in our service business, and that is a matter of warranty. And we've gone from very limited warranty periods and very strictly controlled warranty expense to just a wide open sort of thing. And today most of your customers are looking for warranty repairs on their cars, and it's very hard to get them to do just the maintenance things required. So it's really a different ballgame completely.
Has the marketing side of the service side changed any from the 40s to the 60s or 70s? How you market the service side? Did that change at all?
Well, as I said, the big change came about by the fact that people have been educated to think that they're entitled to free service on their cars. Answer this question, if you will. Let's say that the car is warrantied up to 24,000 miles. And at 24,500 miles, something fails on the car. What do you do to satisfy that customer and stay within the perimeters of the warranty program?
Because he thinks you did it on purpose.
A lot of changes that have taken place in the product itself. And we've got a tough competitor in these imported automobiles that have brought out the fact that in some areas our automobiles have not been quite as substantially built as their cars, or at least have led people to think so.
Have you seen over that period of time, has there been a significant change then in what I'll call the quality to the customer?
There's no doubt in my mind that the cars being built today and the last couple of years are far and above better than what we used to have. You've got to remember that as changes take place, as you build new models, new products, and having bogies set there for 27.5 miles per gallon, and your emissions controls, safety controls and all that, you're going to come up with products, and if you've got a timetable to be conscious of, you're going to have products that perhaps fail along the way, in spite of all the testing and everything that's been done. A good example of that is the diesel engine. General Motors was fighting feverishly to get a car to the market that would produce a high number of gallons, a high number of miles per gallon of gasoline or fuel. And they chose an engine that was already being built, a 350 cube engine, and tried to convert it to a diesel engine. And the demands on that engine were so much greater than a gasoline engine. And then another thing that I contributed more than anything to the failure of that product was the fact that people failed to understand the need for regular maintenance. In spite of our trying to encourage them to have frequent oil changes and things like that, they just didn't believe us. But to answer your question, Jim, yes, all you have to do is go out to my 98 out there. It's got 500-600 miles on it. And open the doors and look inside and see how the body is finished off at the door openings. That used to be just left to happen, whatever. It had big weld seams and stuff like that. It's all finished off like some of the foreign cars. Then open up the hood of the car and look inside. It's not a mess of spaghetti anymore, or hoses and things. Things are organized very, very nicely. And you're proud to take a prospect and have them look under the hood. Yes, indeed, that automobile is a lot better than it used to be. And I think it was getting across. You see, we blame labor an awful lot. Sure, they do a lot of things on the line. But after all, it starts with the engineering of the car. That's where all of these things start. If the car is engineered to go together, it's going to go together right. But it's the components, the parts that go into the automobile that give you the problems, give you the headaches. It isn't the engine, transmission. It's little things like the fuel pump and components on the automobile. And the guy that buys that automobile, he says, look, I'm paying $15,000, $20,000 for it. I don't want that antenna to fail after 6 months, do I? He doesn't care that the antenna is only a very small part, but he labels the whole automobile unacceptable when one little part fails.
So you take us into back to the 50s again. We had 55, I think, was the big high production, high sales. We really went out and clobbered the market, so to speak. And then 56 and 57 started to go down again. Was that feeding that big pent-up demand? Is that what caused all of that to happen, do you think?
You've heard of a champagne hangover, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here you got a bunch of people who for many years couldn't get what they wanted. Now suddenly they can get all the cars they want to buy. We had, at one time, if you financed a car, you had to finance it for 12 months. Then it went to 18, then 24, then 30, then 36. Now they're buying cars like mad, and they're financing them. And they got all kinds of devices and ruses. You've got packs on the automobile, you got packs on the financing. And suddenly these people find that they're upside down on their deals. The upside down means that they owe more on the car than it's worth. And a little bit of a downturn in the economy, and suddenly people found themselves in a position where they just had all the automobiles they could handle for a while. We just went hog wild. I think our sales was around 611,000.
Something like that, 5 or 600,000.
For the year 1955, yeah. So it was bound to happen. I mean, this thing was building for a number of years. And suddenly we had all the champagne we could handle for a while.
Where were you stationed in 55? Still in Milwaukee?
In 55, I was a Chicago zone manager.
Chicago?
Yes, and just before.
Okay, we're back.
Well, you might recall that in October of that year, 1955, we had a real tragedy in Oldsmobile, where the late J.E. Stroud, Jim Stroud, who was then Assistant General Sales Manager for the West, and Carl Deist, who was Regional Manager for the West, were both killed in an airplane bombing in Denver, Colorado, where this boy put a bomb in his mother's suitcase, you know. Well, the death of those two people created a need for movement in the sales department. Mr. Vic Sutherland, who was regional manager in the Southwest, headquartering in Dallas, Texas, was moved to Lansing to replace Jim Stroud, and I was moved then from Chicago to Dallas as regional manager to replace Vic Sutherland.
So that was in the fall of 55.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, how long did you stay in Dallas then, George?
Well, until September of 1956,
Okay.
when I came to Lansing as Assistant General Sales Manager for the East.
For the East.
And then you returned to Lansing, and did you stay in Lansing then?
Ever since that time, I've been in Lansing.
All right.
My wife said, "This is the last move." We bought 3 houses in 1 year.
See, George, in 58, that was an interesting car. That was, it seems like that was kind of our low point from a sales standpoint. 290 or 300,000 vehicles or something like that. Can you remember back to any of the whys and wherefores?
Oh, I can remember the 1958. These cars getting bulgier and bulgier and more chrome. And as a matter of fact, it was called the jukebox model. It was a beautiful automobile, but just heavily loaded with chrome. But it's really an amusing aside to that. We would tell dealers and we'd tell customers that if they didn't like a certain chrome trim on the car, we would be happy to remove it and fill in the holes in that. But usually the answer was, "Oh no, we want that on there." But it was just a general downturn in the market. We had quite a recession in 1958.
So it wasn't just the fact that we had a rather
Not
peculiar car.
No, because all the other GM cars were built along the same
They were
line.
also
Oh,
peculiar.
sure. Yes. And then from that time on, we start going into the boom years. By the boom, I mean the booms that stuck out the back of the car.
The fins and
The fins that started.
Yeah.
Cadillac started that fin movement, you know, with a little bit of a pimple on the back fenders. And then Chrysler went into it, and then the other GM cars. And I think if I'm not mistaken, it was the 1959 Oldsmobile. It has that long boom sticking out.
It comes all the way back to the tail.
Yeah.
Yep.
That was the big one, because in 1960, we started to cut down on those appendages.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, sitting in the driver's seat of a 50 or 1960 car, it was very difficult to see your fenders, to see where they ended sloping off, remember?
Did the dealer organization, the sales organization in that time frame have much input into what I'll call the car design itself?
I would say only in this respect that the general manager of the car division was usually very active in the styling of the car. the General Motors styling section created the styling.
Yes.
But I know that the late Mr. Wolfram spent an awful lot of time at the styling section.
Mhm.
At that time, in spite of the fact that the platform of the GM cars were similar, were alike, still you could do so many things with the chassis sheet metal. By that I mean the hoods, the fenders, top panels, and then the radiator grills, bumpers, the taillights, headlights, all done in order to create their own unique identity. But underneath it all, underneath the flounce skirts and things, was the basic automobile, the A, B, and C, and D bodies. Those were all the same.
So the dealer input that was made then kind of went up through the general manager if there was any.
Well, we had for many years, and I think it still exists, the National Dealer Council.
I was gonna ask you about
Mhm.
that.
And
Do you
these-
remember when that began?
Oh, I think that began along about 1955, thereabouts. But the dealers would come in representing dealers from all areas of the country, and we would hold a 2 or 3 day meeting with them. Then the dealers were allowed to get off by themselves, and they would get their recommendations worded, and then they would come in for a general meeting with the general manager, the general sales manager, and their staffs, and then they would relate all of these demands and the questions, and then Oldsmobile had to formulate answers to all those things. But as far as styling is concerned, if they said they didn't like a particular car, then the only thing they could say was, oh, we'll take that under advisement.
Mhm.
Or anything having to do with the pricing of the car. We still have to remember, this is a division of the General Motors Corporation, and of necessity, you cannot be just an entity. You've got to be a part of the General Motors Corporation, and that involves such important things as styling, as production, manufacturing facilities, engineering, and pricing, models and so forth. Did I say pricing twice?
Why was that organization generated then? What created the need for that? The dealer council thing?
Well, it was an organized way, for the dealers to communicate their needs with the division.
So there's
It gave them a sounding board.
Mhm.
I mean, without that, the only way they could communicate was through the zone organizations and so forth, which they did on a regular basis, but this seemed to be more, let's say, more to their liking. They felt that they were being heard this way, in a very formal way.
Okay.
They went on formal notice with us about certain things.
Was that more of a from the bottom up forcing that sort of thing versus from the top down trying to create a thing to help?
No, I don't think I know what you mean by the top and the bottom.
Was that a thing which Oldsmobile developed for the dealers, or the dealers kind of asked for something like that?
I think that came about, well, let's go back a way. You asked when that started. In 1955, we just about had a dealer rebellion.
Oh.
This was a time when we were about to go out on recontracting dealers, which we did every year.
Mm-hmm.
The dealer's contract was good for 1 year. And you'd meet with them at the fall of the year, and you'd cover all of our programs and things with the dealer and anything that was wrong. So at that time it was established that dealers would receive what was called a modification letter, telling them what was wrong with their operation and giving them an opportunity to correct those failings within a certain length of time. If they didn't correct it, then of course they would not get a selling agreement.
Mm.
Well, like so many other things, this might have been a good idea if it had been run properly. In other words, instead of waiting until October of 1955 to nail the dealer, on a regular basis, day after day, year after year, we've been working with the dealers to correct these things. Then before they were invited in for a recontracting meeting, you'd say, now, you're going to be recontracted, but we're going to go on record with you. But instead of that, they waited until the dealer came in and said, surprise, we got a modification letter for you. Well, the dealers just about rose up against the corporation. And the selling agreement, which was already issued to them in the fall of 1955, was canceled. And the late Harlow Curtis made this profound announcement, you know, and told them that there'd be a new selling agreement written. And it took several months before that was formulated. And then it relaxed tremendously the hold that we had on the dealers.
Oh?
It was more in the context of a two-way partnership rather than just the ruling deal up here telling the little dealer what he had to do and what he couldn't do. So it was long about that time that the dealer council came into existence. About 55, 56.
Okay.
I think it's been a very effective thing, however. And then, of course, there's another thing. The General Motors Corporation has a dealer council. Or they have picked dealers across the board to come into Detroit to meet with the chairman of the board. But it gives them an opportunity to express themselves. Now, you got to remember this, that here we come back to this matter of distribution again. And some dealers, rightfully so or not, are fearful that if they raise too much of a hue and cry, that they might be discriminated against by unimaginative people in position that can do these things, you see. So there's a kind of a throttling effect that you have.
Of course, that never happened.
I don't know. I'm merely throwing out some of the things that could happen. No, I think by and large in Oldsmobile we were very, very, very fair with the dealers. I don't have to apologize for anything that ever happened in the zones in which I worked, or the regions, or the halves.
One other thing that I've always wondered about, George, you remember Air Ride?
May I paraphrase that?
Sure.
It made a wonderful production model for the new car announcement show. Do you remember the show? Do you remember the boom on which Florence Henderson sat?
Oh.
And they swung her out over the audience, and she sang this lilting melody, floating on air, floating on air. It was a wonderful idea, greatest idea in the world, but they hurried to get it out, and it wasn't quite ready.
Okay.
What happened, you know, the system depends upon a compressor to provide compressed air, to take care of the inflating the bellows that supports the car. Well, that compressor ran right off of the engine, and it ran at very high speed. It wasn't cooled properly, and it had improper lubrication. So that, in effect, the compressor, when it got to a certain temperature, acted like a diesel, and it kept running. And then impurities which were not filtered out of the air that was being pumped into the bellows would cause blockages or overinflation of the bellows, and the bellows would explode. Does that answer your question about Air Ride? I used to dub it Air Ride. But it was a great idea. It was consistent with Oldsmobile's desire to be out there ahead of competition. And we can name many, many things that Oldsmobile developed, going back to hydromatic transmission, the rocket engine.
Right.
Why, my goodness, any number of things. I can go back in years to 1929 when we were one of the first cars to have a fuel pump on the car. Think of that. We had so many firsts, rifle drilled connecting rods. You can name any number of things. So if we made a little mistake, with the air ride, forgive us.
How, in a case like that where you get kind of a, I'll call it a dud, how did the organization respond to that sort of thing?
Well, you mean like hiding somewhere in a closet? Or?
Well, or was the goal then to shut the thing off and get on to something else, or what? How did we try to fix it?
Let's draw a comparison to Buick and its Riviera.
Mm-hmm.
In 1966, 67, where they had a car that looked like the 1932 Auburn.
Or the Batmobile.
Where the thing came to a peak in the end.
Right.
I ran across Lee Mays, who was the general manager of Buick. And I said, Lee, why don't you quit building that thing, scrap it? He said, have you ever heard of General Motors scrapping a model? They got a certain cost in their tooling.
Yes.
They're going to get that cost out of there regardless. So in the case of the air ride, we're going to build that car as long as we can to try to get the tooling costs and at the same time correct some of these things that are causing these difficulties. Unfortunately, they designed a special frame for the air ride car, so they couldn't switch readily back to the conventional springing. They had to engineer a modification to the frame in order to accommodate conventional springing. That was expensive and time-consuming. But we had people drive their cars right up to the front door of Building 60, was that?
Mm-hmm.
Our old building?
Mm-hmm.
Come in and say, here, you take it. But the theory, the principle was great. Heck, we've got air ride on buses and on big trucks today.
Oh, yes. Right.
But it was just a little thing that created the problem.
Mm-hmm.
George, which boss did you like the best? Would you say was your best boss that you enjoyed?
Mildred G. Clemeson.
No fair.
I mean,
No,
someone
I
else
don't know.
always
I had a lot of good bosses. I think one of the greatest guys that ever worked at Oldsmobile was Jim Stroud. I say that not just because of his very humane and human personality, but because of his knowledge of the business. He was a real business manager. He was all around a very, very fine person. Now, if you look at all the people who've worked for Oldsmobile in your higher levels of responsibility, you find that many of them are versed in certain things better than others. If I were to take one person and say, who do you think was best organized, best qualified in his job, I'd have to say W.O. Lampy. He was without a doubt one of the most knowledgeable people of the business.
Bill Lampy.
However, he had some personality quirks that did not endear him to the average guy who worked for him. But his initials W.O., which was for Waldo Othmore.
Othmore?
Othmore, yeah.
Othmore.
That, we said, stood for well organized.
Well,
And he was that way. He carried little cards about the size of playing cards on which he had listed every factor of a zone operation that you could think of. Dealer sales and all that. He could whip those out. Just like a kid could tell you about a baseball batting average. He could tell you about the dealer operations.
Did you work with Jim Lemons?
No, Jim Lemons was, well, I did work way under him. He was assistant general sales manager for Oldsmobile in 1945 when I was a district manager in Madison, Wisconsin. And my only contact with him, I had to arrange for hotel rooms for Mr. Lemons and Mr. Stroud when they stayed over in Madison one night. My only contact with him. One other outstanding individual whom I recall loved very, very much was Mr. Oh, I had his name here. Wait a minute. Can you stop that a minute? Stop it just. It was Russell Lesher. who was assistant general sales manager in the West when I was made a zone manager, or an assistant zone manager in Milwaukee. Mr. Lesher subsequently became a dealer somewhere in the Oakland zone, and this has since passed on. Outstanding gentleman.
Well, now you worked with Mr. O'Connor's son too.
Well, Pat O'Connor, he was thought about as being the dean of business management. As a matter of fact, I think he's been given credit for writing the manual.
Yes.
And I always think of the first question. The whole manual is written up as a sort of a catechism, question and answer. And I've used this first question many times. As a matter of fact, I had it around the perimeter of my room in Milwaukee. What is the broad purpose of the business management program? And the answer is to help build and maintain a strong and stable dealer organization, and in so doing protect the reputation of the Oldsmobile franchise. And it was almost like the Lord's Prayer as far as I'm concerned, because when you analyze that statement, it tells you everything that you need to do and should know about a dealer and what you should do with him.
And readily understood words.
Absolutely.
Well, now you used to attend staff meetings different times too.
Yes.
How did the different general managers that you worked with conduct their staff meetings? Now you worked your first.
Well,
general
my
manager
first
was
general manager was the late J.F. Wolfram, and his staff meetings were very stiff, very formal, very businesslike. There was absolutely no frivolity. And he would go around and, after covering the general topics, would ask each person there if there was anything that he wanted to report on. Mr. Wolfram had every facet of the business well in hand. He knew something about every person that he talked to. Matter of fact, he knew more about it than the person he talked to sometimes. Now, then we go on to others like Mr. Metzel. Again, a very sincere, very well-organized, serious person. Later on, the late John Belts, he was more relaxed. I remember he set the tone when his first meeting he removed his coat, his jacket. And from that time on, we all removed our jackets when we attended a meeting. And he always liked a little frivolity. And that's about the way it went.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from let's say one extreme to the other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then Mr. Belts was the last general manager that you served under?
Well, there were a few later than that, but by this time I had assumed different responsibilities, and I was not attending the staff meetings any longer.
I see. Well, then what general sales managers did you work with?
Well, I have worked with G.R. Jones and Vic Sutherland.
Tell us about Mr. Jones. G. Rocket Jones.
Yeah, how did he get the rocket?
Well, he inherited that because of the rocket engine.
Okay.
But he was the last of I would call them the medicine men. He would get up before people, and his jowls would jowl, and his spittle would fly, and his eyes would bug out, and the sweat would run off the back of his neck, and he would tell those guys. He would tell them what they had to do. And
Did that inspire them?
well,
You're talking
I
about
guess
the
so.
field people or the dealers? That he would be
Well, I'm
about?
talking about most of the time that I had a chance to observe him was on the occasion of sales meetings among dealers and new car announcement shows and things like that. No, he was really a rough and ready guy. He told it the way it was, told him what needed to be done. Mr. Sutherland, was not that way, not to that degree. Rather soft-spoken, but he let him know, too, how it should be. Then Vic Sutherland was followed by Mike Mehring, who was in there more or less for 6 months. And he was followed by Emmett Feely, who came to us from Chevrolet. He'd been with Chevrolet for 37 and a half years. And he was followed by Mac Worden, who was followed by Bill Buxton, I believe. And Bill Buxton then was followed by Jim Maddox, was he?
Yes.
How were those individuals different from each other then? Can you take us through any of that?
It's hard to say. It's really hard to compare one with the other. I mean, each was an individual. Vic Sutherland was the outgoing, flamboyant type of person.
A salesman type?
Salesman type.
Mm-hmm.
Mac Worden was I'd say the accountant, bookkeeper type, and all the facts and figures. That was one extreme to the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But all very effective in their jobs, I
Sure,
would say.
different approaches.
Mr. Feely had a difficult time because coming to Oldsmobile from the large Chevrolet division where he'd been executive assistant general sales manager for so long, he found it very difficult at times to remember that he was with Oldsmobile and not still with Chevrolet.
Mm-hmm.
But a very earnest, very sincere, and very hard-working individual.
Would you have termed Jones with Bill Holler at Chevrolet? Similar personality? And
Similar personality. Yeah. Similar. Yes. Mm-hmm. Of course, Bill Holler he was always regarded to be the outstanding of all general sales managers.
When did announcement shows of the type, the Broadway show sort of thing, the Florence Henderson, and when did all that get started?
Well, let's go back, say the early 50s. I can remember an announcement show that I conducted in Milwaukee, wherein we invited the dealers in for a lunch, a business meeting, and we had his car, which was a 1950, this must have been 49, 1950, 98, over in a corner with a black cloth covering it. And at the appropriate time, when the regional manager said, and here it is, the all-new 1950 98 series Oldsmobile, two guys that were crouching behind the car pulled this umbrella cloth material off the car, and there it was. Now we went from that to, if I can remember, the first book show, as we call it, was the Mighty O. And that was based on the story of South Pacific. And the staging was like being on board an aircraft carrier. It was tremendously well done. You had this ready room, and then when the stage set turned around, now it becomes the outside of the aircraft carrier, right off the flight deck to the control tower. And then, of course, at the appropriate times, then the cars were revealed. That was the start of this. And incidentally, Mr. G.R. Jones on that particular show was called not an admiral, what do you call a retired high-ranking naval officer? Well, whatever it was, and I reminded him, I said, G.R., that's a retired officer. So anyhow, we progressed a little further and further, and we had shows like My Sister Eileen, Bells Are Ringing, Good News About Oldsmobile, and they used the songs and that sort of thing. And then I remember using some of the patter songs from Music Man. You remember that one, Helen? Let's talk about a rocket, my friend. Hey, a rocket engine Oldsmobile. There's so much room inside that a witch could ride. And I wouldn't be surprised. And we got a letter from the producers of Music Man objecting to our use of that patter song because we were encroaching on copyrighted material, but we were through with the shows by that time. Those are some great experiences, but they were very, very, very expensive.
Yeah.
Well, would the agency have much input on those, George? Or did our own people work those up?
The agency controlled that completely, and Frank Egan was and is a producer of those shows. He is now separated from the agency per se, and he is strictly a producer of shows like that.
Did
Very
we
talented.
kind of develop the idea back in-house, so to speak, or was that an agency proposal to us to try and do that?
Well, you've got to recall that Mr. Wolfram was very much interested in the stage.
Mm-hmm.
His daughter is a graduate from the Pasadena Playhouse.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Wolfram was always interested in staging, theatricals, and so forth. So in order to give our announcement shows a different flavor, why he went that route.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of thing appealed to him. And I think that Oldsmobile really was the first one to do it. And then we were copied by the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And I know by comparison the rest were very...
Of George J. Clemeson, made on November 28, 1988. This is tape number 2 of 2 tapes.
See, then the stage show thing sort of quit eventually.
No, it really never has quit.
It never quit.
It's
Okay.
taken on a little different format. Instead of using a book show, like
Mhm.
one of the well-known musicals, they have built musical extravaganzas around the announcement showing, where they have a certain requirements, the message speech from the general manager, general sales manager, some dancing, some
Mhm.
singing, and car reveals. It's done in a very, very fine manner. You've seen the shows, haven't you,
Oh,
the
yeah.
last couple of years?
Not recently, however.
As a matter of fact, I was involved in the creation of the Wharton Center out here.
Mm-hmm.
I was involved with the Lansing Symphony at that time, and my concern was getting the Wharton Center and the people of Michigan State to consider letting us in the Lansing Symphony use the Wharton Center. So, as it was being built, and as the stage layout was becoming apparent, I made the remark to the people, I said, what a wonderful place for a new car showing.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a hold of some of the people at Oldsmobile, had them come over there, and I said, look, you can drive the cars right in from street level, right out onto this stage. Now, there are many places that we went that we had to do considerable remodeling in order to accommodate the automobiles. This was right out there. Everything's set. So we've had a couple shows at Wharton Center which were very effective.
Mm-hmm.
Now they've elected to show at one big place, like Las Vegas, and invite the people to come out there.
Instead of separate showings.
We used to have a show in every region.
Mm-hmm.
Then at one time we used to have shows here, and we had new car displays in order to show the employees and also our vendors. We'd have 3 days of vendor
Mm-hmm.
showings down at the Civic Center.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd have the shows at the Michigan Theater. But it's gotten to be so expensive, and moving these shows from one city to the other just ran the thing out of sight.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Cutlass name earlier. Perhaps you can take us through how that happened to be.
Well, I think I'm right in recalling that the Cutlass was introduced in 1961. And like every new car, a lot of attention is placed on the naming of the car. And we had many, many committee meetings, which included representatives from the D.P. Brother Agency, Mr. Wolfram, General Sales Manager, and so forth. And we were asked to look at lists of names and provide names. Well, it seemed that the name that most of us liked the best was Cutlass, because it sort of indicated something of a dashing nature. You can see a buccaneer, a pirate. But the late Mr. Wolfram, general manager at that time, insisted that it be called the F-85. And it was rather peculiar how that came about. We were reaching the deadline on this thing, had to come up with a name. And we were attending some kind of a thing down in Washington, D.C., and several of us up in Mr. Wolfram's suite at the Mayflower Hotel. It was a Sunday morning. And he announced that we're going to set the name now. So he gave us a chance again to tell him what we thought. And he said, well, so I guess I'll have to exercise my management prerogative. The name will be F-85. And so many, many people afterwards said, what does F-85 mean? And all you could say, and using Mr. Wolfram's words, well, it's just like a part number. Part number designation, that's it. So that's all we had to go by. But I think behind the scenes was his thought that he wanted to get something dashing for this car. And he was thinking about fighter designations. See, this was, we were still in the war era, you know. The F designation was always a fighter. But we kept that name, F-85, and started to work in the name Cutlass for some of the models. And it wasn't until Mr. Wolfram retired that we finally eased the name F-85 off of every car but the station wagon. And that's what it was, the F-85 station wagon. The rest were all Cutlass. And it's been a wonderful name, been a real great name.
Whoever selected that originally, that was a brainstorm.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I can't really tell you that. Now, some of the names, for example, when we came out with the new station wagon with that raised portion of the roof, you know, with
the Vista Cruiser.
All right,
Yeah.
you're jumping ahead of me now.
Sorry.
Margie Seaton, who headed up our marketing, said, well, and he was thinking about the Greyhound buses, you know. He said, well, it's like a Vista Cruiser. That became the name, you see. I can think of some other instances of naming. In 1956, we had a color. It was sort of an orange color. And Mr. Jones named that color because it was the same color as the telephone in his son-in-law's home out in California. So you can see how these, how do you know where these ideas come to you? Some are good and some are not so good.
How about the Tornado now, George? That was the next kind of big new thing that happened.
Well, I tell you, that was one of the greatest things that ever happened to Oldsmobile. And I recall very vividly how it all started. I think I mentioned to you before that Oldsmobile enjoyed the reputation as being an engineering leader. And sometimes we were referred to as the experimental car. And our competition would say, well, if it's any good, we'll have it. But after a while, we got to figuring that reputation of being an engineering car, that was a good reputation to have. Well, along about 1960, 61 in there, it was determined that we needed something in Oldsmobile to reestablish this image of Oldsmobile as an engineering leader. So they made various studies, and they determined that the only way they could go would be a different kind of car. well, you can't make square wheels or things like that, so the most practical solution was to take those drive wheels and put them up front. And when they got to testing that theory, that they found that there were many attributes there to front-wheel drive that you could only enjoy in front-wheel drive, like steering and roadability, handling, and all these things. So they set about to creating the rocket, the Toronado, the front-wheel drive. And it proved to be everything that they hoped it to be.
Was that basically a Belts conceived thing, or?
Oh no, John Belts was general sales manager at the time that it was introduced, but he was one of
General manager.
many. I think that Harold Metzel had as much to do with that. I think Bob Rollis and many people had a great input into it. Yeah.
How about the name, George? Where did the name Toronado come from?
Well, that was a hybrid name. Came about by examining various names. Toro was supposed to mean bull, I guess. And then you think about it, tornado. But the name itself just was purely phonetic. It didn't have any literal connotation, none whatsoever.
Was that another one where people sat around and chewed on names?
Yes. But it seemed that we came upon that name a little easier this time.
Did we, in our marketing strategy for that vehicle, did we try a different approach with that thing?
Well, it's a funny thing about our marketing approach on it. At first, we estimated the market for that car to be 37,000 units for the year. It benefited from a lot of forward publicity. Trade magazines were talking about it, and spy pictures and all of that. Remember, 2 engineers took cars down east and supposedly undercover. They stayed at a motel overnight, and in the newspapers the next day were pictures of these cars parked outside the motel. But the reception of the car was so great. We had people writing in, sending us blank checks. They wanted one of those Toronados. Well, management thought that we could use that car in order to bolster Oldsmobile's presence in the market in various areas where we were weak, the West Coast, for example. And they thought because of the somewhat limited production that maybe they ought to favor just certain marketing areas. Well, that hit us pretty hard, because we'd have some little banker write in and say, I live 50 miles from Atlanta. I can't get a car from my dealer here, but the dealer in Atlanta is trying to sell me one. We went out on a series of meetings, and all the dealers could talk about is give us more Toronados, because with the relatively few that they were getting, they could make full gross profit. And they thought, let's have a couple more hens laying these golden eggs. So instead of sticking to that production schedule of 37,000 for a year, they raised it radically. And they thought they could build and sell 80 to 100,000. Well, surplus is one car, As soon as one car hits the warehouse, you've got a surplus. And that killed the market. Because the one thing that was appealing to many people was the fact that the car was difficult to get. Then another thing that hurt Toronado was the fact that you had Buick Riviera without the front-wheel drive, selling for several $100s less, and in supply, and dealers willing to discount the car. So you had quite a price differential between the Buick Riviera and the Toronado, and outwardly the car looked the same.
Very similar.
Very simple.
Yeah.
But it did a lot for Oldsmobile's image in the marketplace.
How about things like the 442 and what I'll call performance vehicles? What did those create or do for us?
Well, again, it was a case of trying to improve Oldsmobile's performance image. The younger driver wanted a car that he could, push his foot into the carburetor and have that thing bark. And you know how 442, how the name came about.
Tell us.
Well, it's a, 4 was a 4-speed transmission, quadrajet carburetor for 4, and twin exhaust, 442.
Good.
I think Mr. Buxton was the one who thought of that.
Did he?
Either Bill Buxton or Mac Gordon,
Mhm.
or the other. Yeah. But it was strictly for performance. You find there are companies that do that sort of thing with cars, make modifications. An article this morning's Detroit Free Press about this Shelby, I think his name is, that does that sort of thing. You can take and modify these cars, by modifying the springing, the steering, the tires, changing the compression ratios, ignition, the cylinder heads, carburation, that sort of thing. You can get those cars to perform very well. Of course, Oldsmobile was very, very big in the stock car racing
Yes.
until competition caught us. And then for a while, the corporation handed down an edict that there would be no more emphasis on racing.
When was that? About?
About the time OSHA, highway safety and that sort of
Okay.
thing. Yeah. You remember we had one of the greatest selling points in Oldsmobile was called a reinforced frame. It had side members to the
Oh,
frame.
yes, the guard beam.
Guard beam frame.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, dealers were encouraged to set these cars at about a 30-degree angle on the floor, raising one side up,
Oh.
and having a mirror on the floor so prospects could look down in the mirror and see this guard beam frame. But we had to soft pedal that because there weren't other makes of General Motors cars that had that feature. So someone who might be hurt in a Chevrolet could say, well, it's obviously not built as well as it should be. Look at the Oldsmobiles. You remember those little plastic automobiles that were built by the
Oh,
millions?
yes.
It built a perfect detail, and you could turn that thing over, and here was the guard beam frame.
Yeah.
There was never another frame built like that.
But then the racing thing kind of was a late 40s and 50s sort of thing, and then it faded away kind of. And then it must have been in the 60s we kind of got going again with it with our higher performance vehicles.
Well, I think the whole racing picture has changed. It's become very, very big business now. We've got some very popular racetracks. And whereas these men that drive the stock cars, I mean, they're not against spending $100,000, $200,000 modifying just the stock car.
Did we encourage that in-house, so to speak?
To a degree, yes. To a degree. We made things available for these stock car racers. I was living in Milwaukee up until 1953, and there's a dirt track there in West Allis, Wisconsin. It's the State Fair Park. It's a quarter-mile track, and they used to hold these stock car races there. And our dealer, John Clemeson, Oldsmobile dealer, right across the street from the fair, he used to have a special service wing for his cars, for these cars to service them, those that were competing in these races. And up until about 1950, there wasn't anything that could touch an Oldsmobile. But surprisingly, the Hudson
Yes,
was
with that
really
old
fast.
six.
Yes. Yeah.
And then Chevrolet eventually came along with
Well, you
the
see, in
V8.
'55, Chevrolet got a V8
Right,
engine,
right.
and so did Pontiac. We didn't have the exclusive rights to
Right.
that anymore.
How about George, some of these dream cars that we make, like the F-88 and those things in the 50s, you may remember. Did they use those in any, what I'll call
Well, all right. If you You take a look at that F-88. I think it was built in 1950. And then take a look at the Chevrolet Corvette of 1953. I think you'll see a marked resemblance.
Looks exactly like it almost.
And then you see the Starfire,
Yeah.
which in 1954 brought us the wrap-around windshield, the knee knocker. And then from that time on became standard in 55. No, those cars, each car division, it seemed, back there under Harley Earl. Was it Harley Earl? No, he was engineering. But our chief of styling, Bill, I forget his last name now. But he was the one who fostered these.
Okay.
And of course, they went hand in hand with the General Motors Motoramas of those days, if you
that
remember.
may be what precipitated
And every
those.
car division had its, future automobile showing. Yeah.
Because we have sort of gotten away from that sort of thing now.
Because of the expense. It's
Yeah.
just tremendously expensive. Matter of fact, they're taking the stock, the cars that we build for stock today and making them look that way, trying to. No, we've had to cut back an awful lot because of expense.
When did you retire, George?
In 1974.
74. Right in the middle of the oil crunch.
Just about, yeah.
And you retired from what position?
Assistant General Sales Manager. I had the responsibility for the Home Office Administration.
Who was working for you at that time?
Well, I would say a department like budget.
Is that Bert Green?
Bert Green, and there was the product delivery. There was Richards. At one time, the service department, Claire Oxendale. And then that kept changing back and forth, you see. And actually, I didn't have too much to do the last few years that I was at Oldsmobile. I was getting ready for retirement.
I see. What, if you were to look back over that span of time, what do you think perhaps was maybe the most significant thing which happened? That's kind of a funny question, but...
Most significant thing that happened to Oldsmobile? I'd have to say almost unequivocally the rocket engine. You see, that was strictly Oldsmobile. We did, of course, Cadillac had a similar engine.
Yes.
But they didn't need to go and boost like we did. But it gave us that tremendous boost that we needed. And we picked it, and we ran with it. No question about it. And the beautiful thing was, you win either by reason of the fact that you're very strong or the other person is weak. In our case, we were very strong with the rocket engine, and here is Chevrolet and Pontiac willing to struggle along with their line engines, you see. They looked at it this way, and conceivably you could understand, because at that time we were building and selling everything we could make. Why slow up for something else? One of the outstanding things that I remember that happened in that era, do you recall the hydromatic fire?
Yes. 1953.
That occurred in May of 1953. And I cite that as a very exciting experience because it shows what people can do. I mentioned before, one of the outstanding men I knew in General Motors was Sherrod Skinner. And at the time of that fire, he personally took charge. And they were loading that machinery that was damaged in the fire aboard flat cars while it was still hot, too hot to handle. And much of that equipment was shipped over to areas like Beloit, Wisconsin, Rockford, Wisconsin, to be remade. And then a real coup was the fact that they were able to get some of the Dynaflow production from Buick and modify the Oldsmobile so as to accept that Dynaflow. and to keep us in production until the fall of that year when we came back out with the Hydromatic. It was just unheard of. No one expected that they were going to be able to accomplish that feat.
See, at that time, Skinner was not our general manager.
No,
He
sir.
was down at the corporation.
He was a group executive.
Did the Dynaflow, from the standpoint of the sales side of the house, did that cause any peculiar things to happen out in the, from a selling?
Well, you see, in '53, our production was still somewhat limited. We were still building and selling everything we could get our hands on. It gave us in Oldsmobile an opportunity to evaluate the Dynaflow. And the Dynaflow, while it was a very smooth transmission, was not as efficient as the Hydromatic. I had just been transferred to the Chicago zone, and before I moved my family, I would drive back and forth on occasion to Milwaukee. And to give you an example of comparison, I could drive back and forth on a tank of gas with Hydromatic. With Dynaflow, I could make it up there and partly back. That's the difference, yeah. But it was a smooth transmission. And as the late G.R. Jones said, in talking to the dealer group in Milwaukee, he said it was like halitosis. It was better than no breath at all.
True. Any, what I'll call interesting experiences out on the road when you were pulling shows along and that kind of thing that you could recount?
Oh yes, I can remember. Oh, there were many experiences. What kind are you thinking about, particularly?
Nothing. Just whatever you would come to mind that might be of interest to folks in the future.
Oh, I recall the time that we were all in San Francisco, and the driver put our luggage in the back of this '98 Oldsmobile and threw his coat over the top of the luggage and slammed the door, and in the same motion said, "Oh Lord, my keys are in the coat." We were all standing there, and Mr. Feely was worried about getting to Detroit. In order to get out of the way, I got in the car, and of course the vacuum-controlled trunk lid didn't work because the engine wasn't running. So I pulled the rubber tubes off of the valve and put one in my mouth and pulled on it, and the trunk lid opened. I can still see Mr. Feely looking skyward and saying, "Thank you, Lord." It was one of those crazy things that happened. I still laugh at it.
It wouldn't happen today with the electric one.
No, it wouldn't. But those were little things. I don't care what you did. You try to plan on everything and try to eliminate the variables, but oftentimes things would happen that no one expected. I remember one time in Milwaukee, we were getting ready for a big sales meeting featuring the rocket engine, and worked there all day on the thing. Those days, the zone people did most of the work. Now you hire people to come in to create the staging. And this was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I took time out to have a cup of coffee, and the late Bob Berg, who was the district manager at that time, came to me and he said, "Now I can tell you," he said, "the curtain across the stage fell down on the car. But he said, we got it back up and there's no damage on the car." Now I can tell you about it. But those are things that cause you to die 100 times over.
Yeah.
You know.
At the moment, it's terrible.
Oh, yes. I guess that's about enough.
Okay. George, I do appreciate it.
Quite all right. It was a pleasure, Jim.